Okay, so previously we've talked about during evolution, we see small changes in ancestral species. However, over time, those small little changes are going to add up. And eventually, we say those changes are great enough that a new species forms. So whenever a new species forms, we call that speciation. And so then how do we draw the line between the same species and now two separate species? So how we draw the line between two different species is only individuals of the same species can reproduce viable offspring. Viable means that they can have babies. Okay, so maybe like have their own offspring. So, for example, mules are sterile. So if a donkey and a horse were to mate, they make a mule, but mules can't reproduce and create their own offspring. So that means that horses and donkeys are two different, and this is where we draw the line between separate species. So some more examples of separate species are tigers and lions. So if tigers and lions mate, you can get a tigon, so a male tiger and a female lion that mate in captivity. Again, their offspring are infertile, so that means that tigers and lions are different species. There's also ligers. So ligers form when you have a male lion mating with a female tiger. And again, their offspring is infertile. Okay. So again, since their offspring can't have their own offspring, then we say that their differences are too great and they're two different species. So how did these small changes build up to be great enough to make a new species? So in order for those changes to become great enough to make a new species, there has to be some type of isolation in place. And so we see three different types of isolation that causes speciation. So the first one is geographic isolation. Okay. So that means that individuals, they have to be separated by some sort of geographic barrier, like rivers, mountains, or bodies of water. So here we have this mountain range. We have one type of flower on one side of the mountain range, another type on the other side. Well, these two, they're no longer going to share seeds with each other. So then the yellow flower, it'll stay at this area and keep reproducing with those flowers nearby, and slowly it'll change over time. This orange one will stay over here, and it'll reproduce with other flowers nearby, and that'll change over time. And eventually these are going to change so much that they'll become different species. Next, we have behavioral isolation. So there's some sort of like behavior that's no longer recognized. So examples of those could be like courtship rituals or like mating calls. So here, even though we might have two lizards in the nearby area, they don't recognize each other as a potential mate. Therefore, they aren't going to mate with each other, and then they will evolve separately over time, and small changes will happen, and they'll become different species eventually. And then the last one is temporal isolation. So these are when two or more species reproduce at different times. Okay. So again, you might be geographically close to each other, but if you reproduce at different times, well, then you'll never reproduce with each other. And again, your genes remain isolated, and you'll get enough changes over time that you'll become different species. So here in the picture, we have two different squirrels, and they happen to live on different sides of the Grand Canyon. So if they're on two different sides of the Grand Canyon, they're completely living individual lives. They're not going to mate. So the genes that this squirrel has, it's never going to mix with the genes from this type of squirrel. And so over time, each of these squirrels have changes that occur, and they become different species. So then, in order to signify a change in species over the course of time, we use something called a phylogenetic tree. And so phylogenetic trees, they're just diagrams and they just branch off when a new species is formed. So here is an example of finches. Okay, so at some point in time, there's a common ancestor of all the finches from South American mainland. And then this ancestor over time has changed, and we have one species here, and it branched off into another species here. And so every time we see a corner, it's branching off into a new type of species. So then we can see whatever type of species this is, then we branch off into ground finches versus tree finches. Then if we look at the tree finches, it branches off into bud eaters versus insect eaters, and so on. So we just use these charts to represent different species in regard to time. And then another way we can classify different species is we can use something called a cladogram. And we looked at cladograms on Tuesday. So cladograms are just diagrams, and they show different species, and they also show how close or distantly related species are to each other. So let's take a look at the leopard right here. So the leopard, one thing that the leopard has that none of these other species has is hair. So anything past this mark has to have hair, such as the leopard. And then here we see where the line of the turtle meets the same line as the leopard. So then the turtle and the leopard have to share the same trait right here. And so turtles and leopards have amniotic eggs. So that means any species on this cladogram past the amniotic egg has to have them. Next, if we go down a little bit further, we see the trait of 4 walking legs. So again, any species that branches out past this point has to have 4 walking legs, such as the salamander, the turtle, and the leopard. Then if we move on to this point, we get jaws. So any species past jaws, again, has to have jaws. So tuna, the salamander, the turtle, and the leopard all have jaws. And then last here we have the vertebral column, or you think it has a vertebrae. Okay. So any species past this has the vertebral column. So the lamprey, the tuna, the salamander, the turtle, and the leopard all have the vertebral column. And so if you look at this diagram, we can see that the closer they are together on the cladogram, the more similar and more related they are. Okay. So if we look at the lamprey and the leopard, the only thing they share in common is they have the vertebral column. Okay. Then if we look at the tuna, well, the tuna is a little bit more related because it has the vertebral column and jaws. So that's what it shares in common with the leopard. And if we move over to salamander, salamander is even closer related because it has the vertebral column, jaws, and 4 walking legs. And then if we move on to turtle, well, out of all of these species, the turtle is the most closely related because the turtle has the vertebral column, the jaws, 4 walking legs, and has amniotic eggs.